Tonight, we break down the moves that critics say could push Britain to the brink and why Starmer's strategy is dividing the nation.
Welcome to Power and Policy UK, where we break down the decisions shaping Britain's future, cut through the spin, and expose what's really happening in Westminster.
What if I told you that Britain is closer to a breaking point than at any time in the last decade? Not because of one single crisis, but because of a series of calculated political moves that are starting to collide all at once. And at the center of it all is one man, Keir Starmer. Over the past year, Starmer has been reshaping Britain in ways that supporters call necessary reform, but critics warn could push the country to the edge. Tonight, we're breaking down the latest moves that have sparked outrage, anxiety, and a growing sense that the UK is heading toward a pressure point. Let's start with the economy. Starmer came into power promising stability after years of turbulence, from Brexit fallout to pandemic aftershocks to inflation spirals. He pitched himself as the calm, methodical alternative. But recent fiscal decisions have left both businesses and working families uneasy. Tax adjustments aimed at increasing public revenue have hit middle earners harder than expected, while corporate reforms have sparked concern in the financial sector. The City of London, long seen as Britain's economic engine, is watching closely. Investors were initially reassured by Starmer's centrist tone, but tighter regulatory frameworks and renewed discussions about windfall taxes have created uncertainty. Markets don't like uncertainty, and when investment slows, the ripple effects are felt everywhere. At the same time, public services are under intense strain. The NHS backlog remains stubbornly high. Junior doctors have continued to demand better pay and conditions. Starmer has attempted to walk a tightrope, promising fiscal responsibility while acknowledging worker frustrations. But balancing the books while funding improvements is proving far more difficult than campaign speeches suggested. And then there's immigration, arguably the most explosive issue in British politics. Starmer has shifted away from some of the harsher rhetoric seen in previous years, but border numbers remain a flashpoint. Channel crossings continue to dominate headlines. Critics argue his policies lack teeth. Supporters argue that cooperative agreements with European partners take time. Either way, public patience is thinning. Communities already dealing with housing shortages and rising living costs feel stretched. Local councils warn they're operating at capacity. The perception, fair or not, is that the government is reactive rather than proactive. But immigration isn't the only sovereignty-related tension building. Post-Brexit trade realities are still biting. While Starmer has ruled out rejoining the European Union, he has pursued closer alignment in certain regulatory areas. That has angered hardline Brexit supporters, who see any regulatory convergence as backsliding. Meanwhile, pro-European voters feel he isn't going far enough. It's a political no-man's land, and Starmer is standing right in the middle of it. Energy policy is another battlefield. Speaking of Scotland, the Union itself is under quiet but growing pressure. The Scottish National Party may not dominate headlines the way it once did, but the independence question hasn't disappeared. If economic conditions worsen, nationalist sentiment could easily reignite. Starmer's challenge is keeping the UK united while navigating economic reform. That's no small task. And let's not ignore law and order. Recent legislation aimed at expanding policing powers and reforming protest laws has triggered backlash from civil liberties groups. Starmer, once a human rights lawyer, now finds himself accused by some of overreach. The irony isn't lost on his critics. Balancing public safety with civil freedoms is a delicate act, and perception matters just as much as policy. Foreign policy adds yet another layer.
The UK continues its strong support for Ukraine while recalibrating trade relationships globally. Defense spending commitments are rising, putting further strain on public finances. Meanwhile, relations with major global players require diplomatic finesse. Every international decision feeds back into domestic politics.
So why does this feel like a breaking point? Because these issues aren't isolated, they're stacking. Economic pressure plus housing shortages plus strained public services plus immigration tensions plus regional divides equals volatility. Individually, each challenge is manageable. Together, they create a sense of national fatigue. Public mood matters. Polling suggests trust in institutions remains fragile. Many voters aren't necessarily angry, they're exhausted. They want stability, but they also want visible improvement in their daily lives. When grocery bills remain high, rent climbs, and GP appointments are hard to secure, patience runs thin. Starmer's leadership style, cautious, methodical, lawyerly, is designed to project competence. But critics argue that in times of mounting pressure, voters want boldness, not careful calibration. They want decisive action they can feel immediately. Supporters counter that Britain's problems weren't created overnight and won't be solved overnight. They argue Starmer is laying foundations for long-term repair, even if short-term discomfort is unavoidable. The question is whether the public will grant him that time. Political capital is a finite resource. Every controversial decision spends a bit more of it. If economic growth doesn't accelerate, if public services don't visibly improve, if migration numbers don't stabilize, pressure will intensify, not just from opposition parties, but from within his own ranks. History shows that British politics can shift quickly. Governments that appear stable can suddenly find themselves battling internal rebellion, by-election shocks, or mass public protests. The mood of the country can turn in months, sometimes weeks. So is Britain truly at a breaking point? Not yet. But the ingredients are there. A squeezed middle class, frustrated young voters locked out of housing, businesses wary of regulatory change, regional inequality still unresolved, cultural divides amplified by social media, and a government trying to prove it can deliver structural reform without triggering economic backlash. The coming months will be critical. Budget statements, growth figures, NHS performance updates, and migration data will all shape perception. If tangible improvements appear, Starmer could solidify his image as the steady hand Britain needed. If they don't, the narrative of breaking point could become self-fulfilling. And here's the political reality. Perception often becomes reality in modern politics. If enough voters believe the country is heading toward crisis, markets react, opposition parties mobilize, and governing becomes exponentially harder. The pressure is building, the balancing act is narrowing, and every decision now carries amplified consequences. So the real question isn't whether Starmer is making bold moves. It's whether Britain can absorb them without cracking. What do you think? Is this necessary reform in difficult times, or is the country being pushed too far too fast? Let me know your thoughts below. And if you want more deep dive political breakdowns like this, make sure you subscribe, because the story of Britain's future is unfolding right now, and we're going to be tracking every twist and turn.
This is Power and Policy UK, your source for sharp analysis on the politics that impact your life. Subscribe now and stay ahead of the power game.